up the house rules. I'll just run through them quickly, but I want to say good afternoon to everyone. Good evening, good morning, whichever applies. We're really happy to have you here today with us for this last day of conference. Can we see the slide?
Yes, 1 minute, please.
Oh, okay, sure. I suspect by now that most people are familiar with the protocols, namely that you should, as soon as you enter the conference, to just put your name and your country in the chat box so that we have a record of who was present. Mute your audio and turn off your video during the session. It just simply helps with the width, the broadband width. And if you've got any questions during the session, please use the chat to record them, and also just let us know who it is that's given the question. Having said that, our question chat box will be monitored very closely by this afternoon's moderator, who is Emmanuel Sibanda from Umalusi. He was part of the conference committee. So welcome, Emmanuel, and thank you for all that you've done to make this conference a success. And you and Katlego, I know, are going to be watching closely to make sure that we don't miss anyone's questions. Without any further ado, I think I'd like to start with today's proceedings. And in addition to welcoming everybody else, particularly to welcome Isabel Nisbet, who is our keynote speaker for today, with a title, Fairness and Assessment Looking Forward from the Pandemic. What if we're talking about fairness and assessment, the pandemic has certainly brought that question right to the fore of all our thinking. Just a quick note about Isabel. Isabel is a well-known person to IAEA and certainly a great friend of ours. She's certainly well known for her wonderful sense of humor during presentations, particularly keeping us all entertained. But besides that, she has a great academic background in philosophy, nonetheless. My son would be very pleased to meet you. And her professional career has been in government and regulation in the UK, including the regulation of medicine and medical education. She is the founding CEO of Ofqual, the statutory regulator of examinations and qualifications in England. And for 3 years, she worked for Cambridge Assessment in Southeast Asia, based in Singapore. Isabel has served on the boards of governors of 3 UK universities and has continued to pursue her academic interests, notably in ethical issues and their application to education and social policy. She serves on 2 committees advising the UK government on ethics. I think there's a few other governments that would probably benefit from that. Isabel is an affiliated lecturer at the University of Cambridge and the co-author with Stuart Shaw, also well known to IAEA and a great friend of IAEA. And the book is called Is Assessment Fair? She's just told us today about her appointment to a committee that will be reviewing education in Northern Ireland, and we wish you all the very best in that endeavour.
Thank you.
Isabel, if we can commence with your presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Indeed. Excellent. I'm going to be talking about fairness in assessment, and thanks for the opportunity to do that. And many congratulations to the conference organisers. It's been a really good 2 days so far. And as we start the last day of the conference, it's often quite good to ask some fundamental questions, and we're going to do that. I've given myself a title, From the Outside In, which may look a bit mysterious, but I hope it'll be clearer later on. Now, I'm just going to start again because it's not going to show. Let's try again. Here we are. And here they are. And this is about for the whole assessment community, whether we work in assessment organisations or for governments or we're academics or teachers. Is what we do fair? Do those whom we serve, and I use that word advisedly, think that what we do is fair, and what can we do about it? And I'm going to talk very briefly about fairness itself, what it is and why it matters, but concentrate in this talk on 3 types of challenges to fair assessment. Firstly, theoretical challenges from assessment theory. The second, which is much more risky and controversial, is challenges from critical theory and culture wars, which we're all experiencing. And the third group are challenges from the COVID experience. And then I'm going to start to suggest to you a different view of fair assessment, which I'm calling from the outside in. But at the end, I'm going to leave with you a series of questions, not questions that we can answer in the 10 minutes after I finish, but questions to take away, to apply to our work in the future. So why does fair assessment matter? Well, it may be obvious to you that it does, but it's perhaps worth just thinking why. It's a fundamental moral value, fairness in our society, in our lives, and for many of us in our professions. And even before COVID, many of our countries had increasing controversy about the fairness of national or high stakes exams and tests. In particular, there's been a long rising debate about the use of tests for college and university entry, and we heard a lot about that in Randy Bennett's really interesting webinar. We heard about the test optional choices made by universities in the United States, and in some cases test blind approaches, and the reasons for doing this was because of accusations, right or wrong, that the tests that were being used were in some sense unfair. And going alongside that has been a parallel debate about fair selection for employment, which is a key use of assessment. And again, in the United States, this has led in the mid-20th century and beyond to the formation of what's known as the uniform guidelines. And these are sort of legally based protocols to be followed when in a selection test, one group of applicants, for example, an ethnic group, do markedly differently from another. There's a series of steps that have to be taken. And that itself has prompted people to ask what's become known as the diversity validity dilemma. If in a selection test for a job, for example, the white candidates do much better than the black candidates, does that mean that it's an unfair test? Or is it a fair test that's fairly recording something out there that may itself be unfair? And then there's also the increasing use in recent years of the metaphor of a test as a thermometer, that the thermometer isn't a cause of the differences of temperature of the patient, but it measures it in some objective way. Is that an appropriate metaphor, or is it letting assessment off the hook? All of these questions are live. Then we've had discussions of cheating. We had an interesting exchange on that yesterday. And in academic writing, an increased academic focus on fairness in assessment. And we're told by Worrell and others that the big 2, validity and reliability, have in many cases become the big 3, validity, reliability and fairness. And underneath all of that, any of you who have been or are parents of small children do not need to ask this question. It's pretty clear to you that fairness matters and people care about it. We're told by the psychologists that concern about unfairness is what they call a pre-social emotion, starting in infancy and continues through life. We care about unfairness in a way that we don't say that we care about things like validity and reliability. It's at a different level that we care about this. And more recently, we've had the COVID experience, and we heard on Tuesday, very interestingly, how the different countries have had to respond. But an ongoing theme there has been that in many countries it's been found that existing inequalities and injustices in society have widened during the COVID period, and they've been focused on and exacerbated. And also attempts to assess fairly, and we heard from Dennis and others how that was done, have been scrutinised and in some countries criticised. And in my own country, in the UK, there are senior people who lost their jobs as a result of that criticism, so it's pretty serious. And then we've got ongoing controversy, debate, division about values in society, which in many countries here are becoming increasingly vocal and increasingly divisive. And I do recommend the super book by Robert Putnam called The Upswing that traces that history of divergent views and convergent views in the 20th century in the United States. And if you feel that the areas of assessment that you deal with are too objective, in inverted commas, to be affected by this, I've just suggested a couple of references there to the reading wars and about race and school mathematics that might at least make you rethink that. And here's an example. Stuart Shaw and I spoke at an American conference much earlier this year, at a time when awareness of the issues of racial inequality, particularly in the United States, and the implications of the Black Lives Matter movement were very much in everybody's mind. And thinking back on my attendance at seminars and discussions at that conference, I felt that those who attended were roughly divided into three groups. The ones on the left I've called informed spectators. They were intelligent citizens who were keeping an eye on these issues, but when they were doing their assessment task, that was a different question. That was their day job, so they just got on with doing that. On the right-hand side are the passers-by, and there weren't that many of them who had no interest at all in the issue. A large number were in the middle group of what I've called worried engagers. They're people who felt that these issues did affect education and affected assessment and their role in assessment, but weren't sure how that should work out. So what does fairness mean? Now, in our book, Stuart and I do distinguish a number of meanings of fair, and I'm not going to go through those, but I've listed some there. I'm going to focus on one or two. The second one that I've called implied contractual. Something's fair if it meets the legitimate expectations of those affected, and it's unfair if it doesn't. I remember a headline in a tabloid in the UK, angry students crying in the toilets about unfair history exam, that's what it said. And what they meant by that was, nobody told us there would be a question about the Paris Peace Treaty or whatever it was. It was our expectations were not met, and that's unfair. Now the one I've got, number 3, is the one that you'll probably be thinking about, and it's what we're calling relational fairness, treating like cases alike. And that's a sort of equality. I say a sort of because in most of our assessments we don't expect identical outcomes for every candidate, but we expect them to be treated the same in relevant respects, and that begs the question of what is relevant. But the fourth one there is important too, that I've called it retributive, that something's fair if it's an appropriate reward or penalty for prior behaviour. The outcome is deserved. And in the philosophical writings about fairness and its relation to justice, particularly in the English language, there's 2 root concepts that underlie it all. One is equality of a kind, and the other is desert. And the 2 are very important in thinking about fairness. Now, why do these definitions matter? Well, with great trepidation, I'm going to share with you a Scottish philosophical joke. I should say that philosophical jokes, let alone Scottish ones, are not usually funny, but here we go. That is a picture of a traditional old kind of building with a very narrow passageway between 2 high buildings. And that, in Scotland they're called closes, and this is Advocates' Close in Edinburgh. And the tradition is that women, it was always women, had great arguments across the close. They opened the windows and shouted at each other, and sometimes threw objects down, either at each other or at the unfortunate people walking underneath. But the philosophers said that these arguments were never resolved because they were arguing from different premises. Well, with apologies for the joke, the point is, the reason I'm lowering the tone to share this with you is that that picture epitomises much of the discussion about unfairness and assessment during COVID. Almost all the time, the people who were complaining meant a different thing by fairness from the people who were replying to the complaints, and hence nobody was satisfied. Now I'm going to move to the first of my group of challenges, theoretical challenges, and particularly problems with what I've called the received view of assessment fairness. And to summarise horrendously, I think the received view that emerges from much writing is that fairness is a matter concerning candidates or test takers, or some people think groups of these candidates, and unfairness happens when the outcomes for different candidates or different groups vary because of attributes that are not the construct being measured, construct irrelevant attributes like ethnicity or social class. And the good practice is to minimise the risk of unfairness in advance at the design stage, and this is universal design, and to use analysis in arrears to investigate possible unfairness through, for example, differential item functioning analysis and various forms of that. However, this received view, first of all, it's focusing on relational fairness. And remember, I mentioned there were other senses of fair as well, and there are the other senses, and it focuses on relational fairness without asking, why does relational fairness always matter? Why is it always important to try and aim for that? And now I can think of some examples when it clearly is important. If, for example, you have 400 well-qualified students all wanting entry to a medical school course that's got room for 21, you need to judge in a fair way among the 400. But all life and all education and all selection is not like medical schools, and I'm suggesting to you that the importance of relational fairness is much weaker if there is no, what the economists call, competitive access to limited goods. And I'm going to talk about some examples where it might be less important. Also, I suggest there's too much focus on groups. What about fairness to all candidates or fairness to individual candidates? I'm going to talk now about a particular challenge from recent writing by Bob Mislevy, about a concept that he's called conditional fairness, and which I've found particularly interesting. This has been prompted by his increasing awareness and understanding of diversity among test takers, particularly racial diversity in the United States. And one of his propositions is that making tests identical for all examinees can make them less fair rather than fairer, because the same content may not be equally meaningful or accessible to all candidates. And he's a theoretician, and he says that we need to put the assessment argument, the argument with tasks and evidence and inference, into context. The identical assessment tasks may not provide the same evidence, the same information about the knowledge and skills of the candidates. And he suggests these are not just statistically random differences, but need to be taken account from the outset in the assessment argument. And he offers a very detailed and rich theoretical structure for universal design, taking account of these differences from the outset and not just seeing them as a matter of tweaking some standard format at the end. Now, what can we learn from this? I suggest to you that his insight that the assessment argument, the theoretical argument, needs to be seen in context is an important one which we can learn from. I think many of us would agree that the principles of universal design can support fairer assessment. And I think we may be persuaded by him that even varied tasks informed by universal design can lead to equivalent outcomes. But I'm going to take the argument one step further. Is equivalence always required for fairness? Now, he's using equivalence in quite a technical way, but I'm asking the parallel question about the concept of comparability, which is often used in similar ways. Is it always required for fairness? What if it's not essential for a fair outcome? I've talked before about university entry and the worries about tests. In some states and some countries and some places that are represented by people here, the norm is for almost all students who progress with their education beyond high school to go to their local college or their local university. The question of which university and selection is not as important as what's best for them to do. And the most important thing is to have informative and rich information about the student. The fact that exactly the same information is produced about each one and that the same criteria are used as are used by other universities are much less important. And that leads us to the challenge of the link between fairness and validity. What is the link? Now, in the book which Stuart and I wrote, after much headbanging, we concluded that there was a relationship, but we thought that validity was a necessary but not sufficient condition for fairness. But I'm now beginning to have further thoughts. This is not totally original. I've been influenced by many others, including Stobart particularly. I'm suggesting to you that there may be three approaches to validity. One I've called internal, when it's about what's inside a box where your assessment is, and validity is about the coherence of the structure and the content of the assessment for its intended purpose. But the second one I've called marginal. It takes into account the links between bits inside the box and bits outside, the link with selected real-life contextual factors like the opportunity to learn before and the use after the test. But the third I've called external or situated, starts with the assessment not in a box, but as a real-world event, in a real context, at a real moment in time. And it makes a judgment about that event, and it may derive conclusions about the things inside the box, but it starts outside the box. And I'm beginning to think that it's that approach to validity that we need to think further about. Assessment theorists have seen fairness as a kind of child of validity. I'm suggesting it's probably a grown-up child now because it has its own chapter in books. But they started with validity and developed ideas of fairness from it. The received view of fairness was quite narrowly originated from a conceptualization of validity. But I'm recommending to you, hence the title for this talk, the outside-in approach. I'm starting with fairness as a societal concept and applying it to activities, including assessment, but also to other aspects of education, policy choices, curriculum design, financial choices, and the like. And I'm now going to move, if that was controversial, into real hot water and talk about challenges from critical theory. And I have in mind lots of variants of theories which are in many parts of the country, in many parts of many countries, highly controversial, in some cases banned from certain contexts, including critical race theory, critical discourse analysis. I could have added another 2 lots of labels to that list. But there's some key messages that they seem to have in common, and they are that institutions, including schools, government organisations, assessment organisations, voluntary and imposed groupings of individuals, can be institutionally or structurally unjust or biased. And their activities and the activities of people in them, like ourselves, can reflect or reinforce the underlying power relationships, whether or not that's intended. And the other challenge from critical theory is known as intersectionality. And that means that lots of social categories that we think of separately, like gender, ethnicity, religion, poverty, health, they actually interrelate in very deep and complex ways. You'd have to build 3-4-dimensional models to reflect that. And there are underlying power relationships going through all of them. And Michael Apple has written very well on that. Social scientists sometimes use the label the poor, black, unhealthy single mother. That's not meant to be disrespectful. What it's meant to say is that how do we analyse the position of that person in society? Do we go by poverty, by ethnicity, by health, by family status? And you could add more and more to that. And the fact is that they all interrelate. And if you take one of them separately, you may miss the more important underlying picture. Now, linking to questions of fair assessment, the critical theorists of these various kinds would say you need to stand back and consider the institutional context that you're working in and the underlying power relationships. Who benefits from your assessments and who does not benefit? Well, how should we react to that? Is this all just politics gone mad? Or is it something that's so worrying that we can't get on with our work? Or is it something in between? Well, it seems to me that the critical approaches ask legitimate questions, starting from what is right for society. It is right for us to look critically at the institutions we work in and to realise that we're influenced by them. And particularly for those of us who do psychometric work, we must realise that when we do that, we're breaking down our material into categories, and sometimes that will fail to take account of intersectionality. What if the categories we're using are themselves biased? What if the comparators that we've used to set up our diff analysis is itself biased? And what if all assessments of some kind have been unfair? They could be reliable because they could repeat the unfairness each time. But what about that question? However, in my view, that doesn't mean that you rule out good micro practice to improve the fairness of assessment, for example, universal design. I think there's always going to be a place for what Michael Apple has called disciplined deep dives into good practice. And my third challenge is from the COVID experience. And we've heard a lot about that in this conference, particularly on the second session on Tuesday. And we heard what various countries did to try to cope and to improvise in a very challenging environment. And as you heard from Dennis Oppos, in some countries, including the United Kingdom, in the absence of traditional exams, there was an attempt to estimate marks by statistical methods using an algorithm, and this was very badly received. And I want to have a look at that experience and what we can learn from that. So this is a UK example, but there are some wider principles that apply to the use of algorithms and fairness in assessment, but also in other areas as well. And I've called it the mutant algorithm because that was the label used by our Prime Minister, by Boris Johnson, when he described it. And there was a decision, as you heard from Dennis, it was impossible to hold mainly terminal written exams in the normal way. The aim was relational fairness across the cohort as a whole, fairness across a whole population. That was Ofqual's phrase. And statistical models were developed to predict grades based on historical information about schools and individuals and rank orderings by teachers. These models were extensively tested and consulted on, but when they were used, there was an outcry. And the various governments in the UK at different speeds did a U-turn, and they decided to use the grades proposed by teachers instead, and that led to significant grade inflation and some unfairnesses, relational unfairnesses between types of school and between subjects. So, what was unfair about algorithms? They were made up with an effort to be fair. I suggest to you that the aim was for relational fairness, but the approach failed to achieve the second wing of fairness, desert. Remember I said there were two philosophical ideas, equality and desert. Students and parents felt that the grades did not reflect what they had done. They reflected some statistical model that had been applied to them unfairly. And I suggest to you that the use of statistics can help to achieve relational fairness across a cohort as a whole, as Ofqual said, but relational fairness in the aggregate must be balanced with individual desert. And my labelled maxims there reflect very much what we heard yesterday about the use of artificial intelligence in digital first assessment. I'm suggesting to you algorithms work better with human engagement and humans work better with algorithmic supervision. So, for example, we're learning more about possible bias in teachers' judgment in relation to gender or race. And there's an underlying problem in the story of the algorithm, which I'm going to put to you. I've simplified slightly in how I'm going to put it, but it's a very profound problem. And here it is. I'm asking you to imagine that a teacher thinks correctly, we'll say, that 10 of her students have a strong probability, say 80% probability of getting an A grade. They're really good. They're A grade level and they're told you're a grade A student and they're expecting an A. In so-called normal times, 2 out of these 10 would not perform so well on the day in an exam, and they would get a B. Now, the algorithm, aiming for relational fairness, was aiming also to make the present like the past and be the same for everybody. It would award a grade A to the top 8 in the group, according to the teacher's rank ordering, and a B to the bottom 2. But the bottom 2 who received a B are absolutely furious. Their grade's been lowered by a mutant algorithm. It's not fair. Now, my question to you, which I'm going to leave with you and not answer, is which is the fairer mark for the bottom 2? Is it an A or is it a B? If you think it's an A because it reflects the quality of the student's work in the course, then that has profound implications for the fairness of the exam system, which many of us have inherited in our countries. So I'm pulling this together and suggesting to you that we need to look at fair assessment from the outside in. I'm suggesting that fairness in assessment should be seen as a societal concept, not a specialist offspring from validity. Both of the component ideas of fairness, equality and desert, need to be considered. And I suggest the assessment community has tended to overlook the importance of individual desert, and the revolt against the algorithm in the UK brought that out. I'm also suggesting that relational fairness may not always require equivalence or comparability. At a deeper level, it may even be relationally fair to enable each student to show what they can do in different ways. And just to provoke you, reliability perhaps might be an irrelevance if the whole system is unfair in some of the senses that our rather uncomfortable critical theorists are throwing at us. But you say to me at the end of this, it's an unfair world, what can I do? Well, I'd suggest to you that fairness is not a binary on-off switch, but it's a spectrum, and we can aim to make our assessments fairer through trying to make things improved, through what the philosopher Jonathan Wolfe has called fertile functioning, trying to make things a bit better. I suggest there's still an important place for detailed technical work to improve fairness in assessment design, analysis of outcomes. But we can ask questions about the contexts in which our assessments are taken, including the difficult questions posed by the critical theorists. And when we are aware of contextual factors that may affect the fairness of our assessment as an event in the real world, we can talk about them, we can write about them, and we can include them in our reports and our publications. That was my outline, and I promised to finish with some questions for us to take away, not to answer immediately, but to apply to our work in the future, and I'm certainly going to apply them to mine. What is the purpose of the assessment that I'm working on? Who will benefit if this purpose is achieved? Who will not benefit? Who have the best opportunities to learn the subject matter of my assessment? Who has the least opportunities? Is my assessment accessible and meaningful to all or most candidates? Are there any exceptions? Is the content or the construct or the prescribed curriculum for my assessment accessible and meaningful to all candidates? Are there any exceptions? If I'm doing technical or theoretical work, are my assumptions, are the sources I'm using, are the comparators I'm using for my analysis, are they fair? And in the real world context, when my assessment is used, will the outcome be fair, or has it been fair? What do I need to know to answer that? And what can I do to make it fairer? And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for that, Isabel. That certainly provokes a whole range of issues, and certainly has great meaning for us here in South Africa, as well as the rest of the world. Emmanuel, I see you put a notice up to ask people to put their questions in the chat. Can I hand over to you now?
Yes, thank you very much, Chairperson. Let me just show my video. Yes, as you introduced me, my name is Emmanuel. Otherwise, thank you very much, Isabel, for a fantastic and insightful presentation. I'm waiting for people to ask questions. Otherwise, what I'm seeing now are just accolades, a brilliant talk. And but here's the first question, Isabel, for you. Could the fairness of an individual run counter to the fairness of the cohort/population? For example, in your algorithm example, could it have been fairest for the 2 students to receive the A, but for the population as a whole, for them to receive the B?
I think that's an excellent question, because what that questioner has pointed out is that fairness is not always about individual candidates. It can be about wider society or about users of the assessment outcome. And I think the question is it fairer to the users of the outcome if the ones who have the bad exam get the B? And my question to that would be, possibly it would, if they're trying to make decisions on the same basis as they've done in previous years, then it would be. But the underlying question is that judgment going to give them the right information about the candidates? Is it right to say that these are B grade candidates compared to the ones who have a better day in the exam? I know it's a very fundamental question, but I personally am quite challenged by that, and I don't know the answer.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Here's the second question. On the balance of fairness versus practicality, e.g., not all Learners are home language speakers of the examination versus markers available to mark the papers, manage the translation of exam papers, etc. Which is the bigger concern, fairness or practicality?
And this is where I think Jonathan Wolf's idea of fertile functioning comes in. It isn't a counsel of despair, because you can always make things fairer. So, for example, the guidance that is published by many of the assessment organisations represented here on assessment design, the universal design or fair access by design in the UK, I mean, that guidance is gold dust. It's fantastic stuff. It's already there. So there's an awful lot there that can be used immediately to make things fairer. I think there is a balance with practicality, particularly with issues about translation. And sometimes the importance and significance of translation is more important than others. And I mean, this sounds probably rather an obvious thing to say, but my belief is that we have to consciously make things as fair as we can in the circumstances. So, for example, the work that OECD does about translation for the PISA assessments, it's so important because conclusions about governments and countries are drawn from those, that they put enormous resource into it. But you know, every organisation couldn't put that resource into looking at every one of its tests. It's just not possible. But I do think that we can try to make it as fair as possible and maximise the use of the good practice guidance that's already there. Because one of the things is that that's a win-win for everybody. Usually assessments which are designed with a view to fairness to particular groups are actually best for everybody because they're clearer and they also provide more valid information about the construct. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but that's what ethical life is. It's a life about deciding what the right thing to do is in the circumstances.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive response, Isabel. All I see not necessarily questions, but it's just the appreciations, and I think your presentation is received, and you really gave us a lot to think about. I see appreciations from.
If I'd be allowed to mention one other thing in terms
go ahead.
Of suggestions, I was on the board of the University of Hertfordshire, which is in the south of England. One of the things they did was they had a system called reverse mentoring, where they arranged for each member of the board to be paired up with a member of staff from a different ethnic group from their own. So my mentor was an academic historian called Pete DeSena, who was an Anglo-Indian. And I learned a great deal from Pete, and some of it's reflected in what I've been saying. And I do think that that sort of system for an organisation is one way in which those who are involved in assessment can simply get some insights through getting to know people and getting to know how things that I was quite familiar with simply looked different when looked through different people's eyes. So I commend that scheme, and I'm grateful to Pete for what he taught me, and it's a good system to use.
Okay. And the next question, probably to be the last question, is from Rebecca of IB. Up with the translation issue when assessing in different languages,
yes.
But also the issue of word hungry in inverted commas languages, which could introduce unfairness when they are word counts. Not more of a comment, but there seems to be no literature on this.
I think that's a very, very interesting comment. My question of what's our concept of a good student and who benefits, what's that reflected in? And you're quite right, and she is quite right, that in some languages and some cultures, the use of greater numbers of words is a thing that's regarded as a good thing, and it's a product of the language and of the culture, and in others it's an object for criticism. There's a difference in culture between England and the United States in that, actually. And so all I can say is it points to the concept of what is our picture of a good student in our assessment, and what has influenced that, and who has influenced that? Who benefits from that, who does not benefit from that? And I think it'd be really good if somebody did some work about the word-hungry languages and cultures. That's a really good suggestion.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Isabel. Before I hand over to the chairperson and Oberhosa, let me just conclude by reading this appreciation from Tabeleng of Umalusi. She said, very insightful presentation. Thank you, especially for the challenging questions at the end of the presentation, because that's exactly how I felt, you know, after a presentation. So thank you very much, Isabel. And over to you, Anne. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Yes, so Isabel, you can see if you look in the chat, everybody can identify very closely with the kinds of questions you've raised. And I think they're issues that all of us grapple with to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the homogeneity of our student populations. I would also like to add my thanks and appreciation for your presentation. I think it's wonderful. And I look forward to the sharing of your slides, especially with the additional one of all the references that we can go and tease our brains with. We are running a little early, but may I suggest that we take what have we got, a 10-minute break? So we come back slightly early. We come back at, let's make it 5 to, I don't want to say 3 because 3 affects me. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, whichever is relevant. As we're going to run out of time at the end.